The pen touched the paper before the Duke had even read a single word on the page in front of him. Edmund Whitmore, Duke of Ashcombe, sat behind his heavy oak desk with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on nothing at all. His solicitor, a careful man named Charles Bennet, stood on the other side of the desk holding a leather folder full of documents that would end a marriage of 11 years. "You do not wish to review the terms, Your Grace?" Charles asked, his voice low and cautious. "I have lived the terms," Edmund said. "I do not need to read them." He signed his name at the bottom of the first page, then the second, then the third. His hand moved quickly, almost angrily, as if speed could erase the years that had led to this moment. Somewhere in this house, in a room 3 doors down from where he now sat, his wife Duchess Margaret was packing the last of her belongings into trunks that would be carried away by evening. There had been no shouting. There had been no final argument. There had only been a long, cold silence that had grown between them like ice over a lake, thickening every winter, until neither of them could remember what warmth had ever felt like. Edmund signed the last page and closed the folder. "It is done," he said. "See that it is filed with the courts by morning." Charles hesitated. He reached into a second folder, a slimmer one, and placed a single envelope on the desk. "This arrived for you as well, Your Grace. It came by private courier, not through the usual post. I was told it required your personal attention." Edmund barely looked at it. His mind was already elsewhere, already imagining the quiet nights ahead of him, alone in this enormous house, free of a marriage that had never once felt like a home. "Leave it with me," he said. "You may go." Charles bowed and left the study, closing the heavy door behind him with a soft click. Edmund sat alone for a long moment, staring at the envelope without truly seeing it. The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing long shadows across the bookshelves and the portraits of his ancestors that lined the walls. He thought of the years behind him, the cold dinners, the empty conversations, the way Margaret's eyes had stopped meeting his somewhere around the 3rd year of their marriage. He reached for the envelope only because his hands needed something to do. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used by families who did not wish to be forgotten. He turned it over once, twice, studying the wax seal pressed into the back. It was not a seal he recognized. That alone should have made him more careful. Instead, curiosity pulled him forward, the way it always did when something did not quite make sense. He broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter, and as he opened it, his eyes moved automatically to the bottom, the way a man's eyes often do when he wishes to know quickly who has written to him. The name at the bottom of the page struck him like a blow to the chest. Clara Ashford. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Edmund gripped the edge of the desk with his free hand, steadying himself, though there was nothing physically wrong with the floor beneath him. It was the name. It was only the name. And yet it undid something inside him that he had spent 9 years trying to keep buried. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in almost a decade. He had not allowed himself to think it, not in daylight, not in the quiet hours before sleep, not even in the depths of the coldest nights of his marriage when his mind had wandered to places it should not have gone. Clara Ashford belonged to another life. A life he had been forced to close the door on when he was a much younger man, before the title, before the responsibilities, before everything that had shaped him into the cold, guarded figure he had become. His hands trembled slightly as he began to read. The letter was short. It did not waste time with pleasantries or explanations of where she had been or why she was writing now, after all these years of silence. It went directly to the matter at hand, as though she knew he would need no reminder of who she was or what they had once meant to each other. "There is something you must know," the letter began. "I have carried this alone for as long as I could bear it, and I no longer have the strength, nor the right, to carry it without you knowing the truth." Edmund read the next line 3 times before the meaning settled fully into his mind. You have a son, Edmund. He is 9 years old. His name is Oliver, and he does not know your name, though he asks about his father more with each passing year. The letter fell from his hands and landed softly on the desk. For a long moment, Edmund did not move. He did not breathe. The fire continued to crackle in the hearth, indifferent to the fact that the man sitting before it had just learned something that would change the entire shape of his life. Outside the study window, the last light of the afternoon was fading into a deep orange, the kind of color that usually brought him a small measure of peace at the end of a difficult day. Tonight it brought him nothing but a strange, hollow dread. He thought of Margaret, somewhere in the house, packing her belongings, unaware that the divorce she had just signed away her marriage for had arrived only moments before a letter that would prove far more consequential than any legal document. He thought of his father, the late Duke, a stern and unyielding man who had ended Edmund's relationship with Clara so abruptly, so completely, that Edmund had never fully understood the reasoning behind it, only that it had been final and absolute. He had been told she left willingly. He had been told she wanted nothing more to do with him. He had believed it because at the time he had been young and heartbroken and desperate for any explanation that did not leave him drowning in guilt. Now he wondered if any of it had been true at all. He picked the letter back up, his hand steadier now, though his heart still pounded against his ribs. He read further, searching for anything that might explain how such a thing could have happened without his knowledge, how a child could exist in the world who carried his blood and his name, and yet had grown up entirely without him. I did not tell you because I was told you wanted nothing further to do with me, the letter continued. Your father made it very clear that any attempt on my part to reach you would be met with consequences I could not afford, not for myself, and certainly not for a child I had not yet even known I was carrying. I left because I believed I had no choice. I stayed silent because I believed silence was the only way to protect him. Edmund closed his eyes. The weight of the words pressed down on him like something physical, something he could feel in his chest and his shoulders and the backs of his eyes. I am not writing to ask anything of you, Clara had written near the end of the letter. I am writing because Oliver deserves to know where he comes from, and because I can no longer bear the thought of him growing older without ever having the chance to know his own father. What you choose to do with this knowledge is entirely your decision. I only ask that whatever you decide it with him in mind, and not with the name you carry. There was an address at the bottom of the page, a small town Edmund did not recognize, several hours from the estate by carriage. He sat in silence for a long time after he finished reading, the letter resting in his lap, the fire slowly dying down in the hearth. Somewhere in the house, he heard the distant sound of a door closing, footsteps moving down a hallway, the quiet bustle of servants carrying trunks toward a waiting carriage. Margaret was leaving. The marriage he had just ended was truly over now, in every sense of the word. And yet, for the first time in years, Edmund found that his thoughts were not on his failed marriage at all. They were on a boy named Oliver, a child he had never met, who did not know his father's name, and who had spent 9 years wondering why the world had never given him the chance to know him. Edmund rose from his chair slowly, the letter still clutched in his hand. He walked to the window and looked out over the wide lawns of the estate, the gardens Margaret had never cared for, the fountain that had not run properly in years because neither of them had ever bothered to have it repaired. It struck him, standing there, how much of his life had been built on things left broken simply because no one had cared enough to fix them. He thought of his father again, the man who had shaped so much of his early life with a firm and unforgiving hand, who had taught him that duty came before feeling, that the family name mattered more than any single person's happiness. He had obeyed that lesson for years. He had married Margaret because it had been the sensible match, the expected match, the match that pleased his father and secured the family standing among the other great houses of the country. He had told himself, over and over, that love was a luxury men of his position could not always afford. But somewhere in this world, A boy named Oliver had grown up without a father, without a name, without the simple knowledge of where half of himself had come from. And Edmund could not escape the feeling that this, more than any failed marriage, was the true failure of his life. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, close to his chest, as though it might somehow disappear if he did not keep it near him. A knock came at the study door. "Come in," Edmund said, his voice steadier than he expected. Charles Bennet stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral, the way it always was when he suspected something significant had occurred but did not wish to pry. "The papers have been sent for filing, Your Grace. The Duchess has departed. I wish to inform you before I took my leave for the evening." Edmund nodded slowly. "Thank you, Charles." The solicitor lingered a moment longer than necessary, his eyes flicking briefly toward the desk, where the empty envelope still lay beside the dying fire. "Is everything in order, Your Grace? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Edmund almost laughed at the accuracy of the observation, though there was no humor in it. "Perhaps I have," he said quietly. "Tell me, Charles, how quickly could a carriage be ready to travel a great distance, tonight if possible?" Charles blinked, clearly surprised by the sudden request, but he was too well trained to ask unnecessary questions. "Within the hour, Your Grace, if you wish it." "I do," Edmund said. "Prepare it, I have somewhere I must be." As Charles left to carry out the order, Edmund remained by the window a moment longer, his hand resting over the letter in his coat pocket, feeling the shape of it against his chest like a second heartbeat. 9 years of silence, and it had taken only one name on one letter to bring the entire foundation of his carefully ordered life crashing down around him. He did not yet know what he would say when he arrived at the address written at the bottom of that letter. He did not know how Clara would receive him, whether she would welcome him or turn him away at the door, whether Oliver would even wish to know a father who had never once come looking for him. But he knew, standing there in the fading light of that study, that he could not spend one more day pretending he did not know the truth. The Duke who had signed away his marriage without so much as a glance at the papers now found himself staring at a single letter, as though it held the entire weight of his future within its few short lines. And in many ways it did. Outside, the sound of carriage wheels being readied echoed faintly across the courtyard, and Edmund Whitmore, Duke of Ashcombe, turned away from the window and walked toward the door, toward a truth he could no longer avoid, and toward a son who had been waiting far longer than any child should ever have to wait. The carriage moved through the dark countryside at a pace that felt far too slow for the storm building inside Edmund's chest. He sat alone inside, the curtains drawn back so he could watch the shapes of trees and fences rush past in the moonlight, though he saw almost none of it. His mind kept returning to the same handful of words, over and over, like a wheel that could not stop turning. A son, 9 years old, a name he did not know. He thought of all the birthdays he had missed without ever knowing they existed. He thought of the first steps a child takes, the first words spoken, the first day of learning to read, all of it happening somewhere far away while Edmund sat in his study signing papers and attending dinners and pretending his life was whole. The carriage jolted over a rough patch of road, and Edmund gripped the edge of his seat, steadying himself. Outside, the driver called something to the horses, and the pace slowed slightly as they approached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow river. Edmund barely noticed. His thoughts had already traveled far ahead of the carriage, imagining the moment he would arrive at Clara's door, imagining what he might say, imagining whether there was anything at all that could explain 9 years of silence in a way that would not sound like an excuse. He remembered the day his father had ended things between him and Clara, as though it had happened only yesterday. He had been 22 years old, full of the reckless confidence of youth, certain that love was enough to overcome any obstacle placed in its path. Clara had been the daughter of a modest merchant family, kind and clever and utterly unconcerned with titles or fortunes, which was, he now realized, precisely why he had loved her so deeply. She had never once looked at him the way others did, with calculation in their eyes, with an awareness of what his name might bring them. She had simply looked at him as though he were only Edmund, and nothing more. His father had summoned him to the study one autumn evening, the same study where Edmund now conducted the business of the estate, and had informed him, in a voice that allowed no argument, that the relationship was to end immediately. "She is not suitable," his father had said, without further explanation, as though the matter required none. "You will marry within your own class as your position demands. This is not a request, Edmund. It is your duty." Edmund had argued, had pleaded, had even threatened to leave the estate entirely rather than abandon Clara. But his father had been immovable, and in the end, a letter had arrived at the estate only days later, supposedly written by Clara herself, stating that she wished to end things between them, that she had realized their match could never work, that she was leaving the area and did not wish to be found. Edmund had been devastated, but he had believed it. Why would he not? It had been written in a hand that resembled hers closely enough, filled with details only she would have known. He had spent months in a quiet grief that he never fully allowed himself to show, and eventually, as the years passed, he had convinced himself that it had simply been for the best, that perhaps his father had been right, that some matches were never meant to survive the world's expectations. Now, sitting in the darkness of the carriage with Clara's true letter pressed against his chest, he wondered how much of that final message had truly come from her at all. The carriage rolled onward through the night, passing small villages where lights flickered behind shuttered windows, past fields lying silent and dark under a wide sky scattered with stars. Edmund found himself thinking of his father again, of the man's stern face, his unwavering belief that duty and reputation mattered more than any single person's happiness. His father had died 3 years earlier, and Edmund had mourned him the way a son mourns a parent, with a complicated mixture of respect and quiet resentment that he had never fully examined until this very moment. Had his father known about Oliver? The thought struck him with sudden, sickening force. Had the old Duke known that Clara was carrying his grandchild when he sent her away, and chosen to hide it rather than allow an unsuitable match to taint the family name? The possibility settled over Edmund like a heavy stone, and he found he could not shake it loose no matter how he tried. The carriage began to slow as it approached a small town nestled among gentle hills, the kind of place Edmund had passed through many times in his life without ever truly noticing. A scattering of houses lined a narrow main road, their windows glowing faintly with candlelight despite the late hour. The driver called down that they had arrived at the address given, and Edmund felt his heart begin to pound harder in his chest. He stepped out of the carriage into the cool night air and stood for a moment, looking at the small house before him. It was modest but well kept, with a low fence surrounding a small garden and a single lamp burning in a front window. It was nothing like the grand estate he had left behind, and yet something about its simplicity struck him as more honest than anything he had known in years. He walked slowly up the short path to the front door, his boots crunching against the gravel, and hesitated only a moment before knocking. The door opened, and there she was. Clara Ashford had changed in the 9 years since he had last seen her, though perhaps not as much as he expected. Her hair, once worn loose and wild, was now pulled back neatly, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there before. Lines that spoke of long nights and difficult years. But her eyes were the same, sharp and clear and utterly unafraid, the same eyes that had once looked at him without any thought of his title or his fortune. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Edmund," she finally said, her voice quiet, careful, as though she could not quite believe he was standing there. "Clara," his own voice came out rougher than he intended, "I received your letter." She studied him for a moment, searching his face for something, though he could not have said what. Then she stepped aside, holding the door open. "You had better come in, then." The inside of the house was warm, lit by a low fire and a scattering of candles, simple furniture arranged with the kind of care that spoke of a life built carefully and deliberately, without extravagance but without hardship either. Edmund stepped inside, removing his hat, feeling strangely out of place in a room that seemed to belong entirely to a life he had never been permitted to share. "Is he here?" Edmund asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is Oliver here?" Clara's expression softened slightly, though there was still a wariness in her eyes that Edmund understood completely. "He is asleep upstairs. It is very late, Edmund." Edmund nodded, though disappointment and relief moved through him in equal measure. Part of him had wanted nothing more than to see the boy immediately, to know at last what his son looked like. Another part of him understood that such a meeting could not happen carelessly in the middle of the night, without any preparation for what it would mean. "Sit down," Clara said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "I think we have a great deal to discuss." Edmund sat, and for the next hour Clara told him everything. She told him how she had discovered she was carrying his child only weeks after the supposed letter had been sent ending their relationship, a letter she insisted she had never written. She told him how she had gone to the estate to find him, only to be turned away at the gate by servants under strict instruction not to admit her. She told him how a man claiming to represent his father's interests had come to her family's home instead, offering a sum of money in exchange for her silence and her permanent departure from the area, a sum she had refused at first, out of pride and heartbreak, before eventually accepting out of necessity when she realized she would need to provide for a child alone. "I did not take the money because I wanted it," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly beneath it. "I took it because I had no other way to survive, and because I believed, truly believed, that you had chosen to abandon me. It was only years later, through a mutual acquaintance, that I learned the letter attributed to me had never actually come from my own hand." Edmund sat in silence, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, anger and grief warring inside him in a way he had not felt in years. "My father did this," he said quietly. "He arranged all of it." "I do not know everything he did," Clara said, "but I know enough to believe you are right." The fire crackled between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, both lost in the weight of everything that had been taken from them by a man who had believed duty and reputation mattered more than the truth. "Why did you write to me now?" Edmund finally asked. "After all these years?" Clara's eyes drifted toward the staircase leading up to the room where Oliver slept. "Because he asks about you constantly, Edmund. He asks why other boys have fathers who come to see them, why he has never once received a letter or a visit or even a single word. I have told him stories, kind stories, to protect him from the truth of what I believed had happened. But I cannot keep inventing kindness forever. He deserves to know the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be." And I could no longer bear the thought of him growing older and eventually resenting me for keeping you from him, when in truth, I had believed for so long that you wanted nothing to do with either of us. Edmund felt something break loose inside his chest, a pressure he had not realized he had been carrying for years, not only since receiving the letter, but for far longer, buried beneath years of duty and obligation, and a marriage that had never once given him this feeling, this fierce and sudden need to protect something, to make right something that had gone so terribly wrong. "I want to meet him," Edmund said, "properly, tomorrow if you will permit it." Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face once more for whatever truth she needed to find there. "He is a good boy, Edmund," she said finally. "Kind and curious and far too clever for his own good sometimes. I will not have him hurt again. If you intend to be part of his life, you must understand that it cannot be a passing visit followed by years of silence. He has had enough of silence already." "I understand," Edmund said, and he meant it more fully than he had meant almost anything in his life. I do not intend to disappear again, Clara. Whatever it costs me, whatever my title demands of me, I intend to know my son." Clara nodded slowly, some of the wariness in her eyes finally beginning to ease. "Then you may see him tomorrow morning. But Edmund, there is something else you should know before you meet him." Edmund's chest tightened at the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" Clara hesitated, glancing once more toward the staircase before turning back to him, her expression grave in a way that made Edmund's earlier fears feel suddenly small in comparison. "There is a man in this town," she said quietly, "who has recently taken a great deal of interest in Oliver. A man who arrived only weeks ago, asking questions about his parentage, about his age, about matters that no stranger should have any reason to ask. I do not know who sent him, Edmund, but I fear that whatever secret your father worked so hard to bury may not remain buried for very much longer." Edmund felt a cold chill move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Who is this man?" he asked, his voice low and careful in a way that surprised even himself. Clara shook her head slowly. "I do not know his name, but I intend to find out, and I suspect, Edmund, that you may need to help me do it before whatever he intends comes to pass." Morning arrived slowly, gray light spreading across the small town, as Edmund sat in the modest guest room Clara had prepared for him, having slept little through the remainder of the night. His mind had turned over every possibility of who the stranger might be, and none of the answers he arrived at brought him any comfort. He dressed carefully, though there was little he could do to disguise the exhaustion in his eyes, and made his way downstairs where the smell of fresh bread and warm tea greeted him. Clara stood near the small kitchen table, and beside her, seated on a wooden chair with his legs swinging back and forth because they did not yet reach the floor, was a boy. Edmund stopped in the doorway, unable to move for a long moment. Oliver had dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead, the same shade Edmund remembered seeing in old family portraits of himself as a child. His eyes, when he looked up and noticed the stranger standing in the doorway, were a clear, thoughtful gray, and there was something in the set of his jaw, some small, stubborn tilt, that Edmund recognized immediately as his own. "Oliver," Clara said gently, "this is Edmund. He has come a long way to meet you." Oliver studied him with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child, tilting his head slightly. "Are you the man Mother writes letters to sometimes and never sends?" Edmund's chest tightened painfully. He glanced at Clara, who looked away, a flush of color rising in her cheeks. "I suppose I am," Edmund said carefully, lowering himself into the chair across from the boy so that they were closer to the same height. "Though I did not know about those letters until yesterday." Oliver considered this with the seriousness only a child can bring to such matters. "Mother says you were far away and could not come. Were you far away?" "I was," Edmund said, and found that his voice had grown unsteady in a way he had not expected. "Farther than I should have been. I am sorry for that, Oliver. I did not know you existed until very recently, and I intend to make up for the time we have lost if you will let me." Oliver studied him a moment longer. Then, with the simple forgiveness that only children seem capable of offering so freely, he nodded and returned his attention to the bread on his plate. "Do you know how to fish?" the boy asked between bites. "There is a good spot by the river, but Mother says I am not to go alone." Despite everything weighing on him, Edmund felt something loosen in his chest, something that might have been the beginning of hope. "I know how to fish," he said, "though it has been a great many years since I have tried." "Then you are out of practice," Oliver said matter-of-factly, "and I shall have to teach you." Clara caught Edmund's eye over the boy's head, and for a moment, something passed between them, some shared understanding of how strange and wonderful and fragile this small scene truly was. The morning passed more easily than Edmund could have hoped, filled with quiet conversation and Oliver's endless questions about horses and carriages, and whether it was true that Edmund lived in a house with more rooms than the boy could count on both hands. But as the sun rose higher and the town outside began to stir with the business of the day, Clara's expression grew increasingly troubled, and Edmund knew the matter of the stranger could not be avoided much longer. After Oliver had been sent to play in the small garden behind the house, under the watchful eye of an elderly neighbor woman who often looked after him, Clara turned to Edmund with the same gravity she had shown the night before. "His name is Weston," she said. "I learned it only yesterday morning from the innkeeper who rents him his room. He arrived nearly 3 weeks ago and has been asking questions of half the town since, always about a woman with a young son, always about matters concerning inheritance and legitimacy." Edmund felt his blood run cold. Legitimacy. "That is the word the innkeeper used," Clara said. "I do not know what it means in this context, Edmund, but I do not think it bodes well for either of us." Edmund rose from his chair and paced the length of the small sitting room, his mind working quickly through the implications. If someone had learned of Oliver's existence, if that someone had connections to matters of inheritance, there was only one explanation that made any sense to him at all. "My cousin," he said slowly, "Reginald Whitmore." Clara looked at him with confusion. "Your cousin?" "He is next in line for the title after myself," Edmund explained, his voice growing harder as the pieces settled into place. "I have no children with Margaret. We tried in the early years, but it never came to pass, and eventually we simply stopped speaking of it. Reginald has always known that if I died without an heir, the title and everything attached to it would pass to him." "And if Oliver were recognized as your son," Clara said slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes, "he would no longer be next in line." "No," Edmund said grimly, "he would not." The realization settled over the room like a shadow. If Reginald had somehow learned of Oliver's existence, and if he understood what that existence threatened, there was no way of knowing what lengths he might go to in order to protect his own position. Edmund had never known his cousin to be a particularly kind or generous man, but he had also never suspected him capable of anything truly dangerous. Now, sitting in Clara's small sitting room with the weight of this new knowledge pressing down on him, he found he could not be certain of anything at all. "We must be careful," Edmund said. "If Reginald has sent this man Weston to investigate, it means he already suspects something. We cannot simply confront him without knowing exactly what he intends." "What do you propose we do?" Clara asked. Edmund considered the question carefully, his mind moving through the possibilities with the same careful precision he applied to matters of the estate. "I will return to Ashcombe and make discreet inquiries of my own. If Reginald has learned of Oliver, I need to know how, and I need to know what he intends to do with that knowledge before he has the chance to act upon it. In the meantime, I do not wish to leave you and Oliver unprotected." "We have managed well enough on our own for 9 years, Clara said, a hint of her old independence returning to her voice. "I do not doubt it," Edmund said gently. "But this is different, Clara. If Reginald believes Oliver's existence threatens his claim to the title, he may see the boy not simply as an inconvenience, but as an obstacle to be removed by whatever means he considers necessary. I will not risk that possibility, not now that I know the truth." Clara's face paled slightly at the implication, and she glanced toward the window, where Oliver's laughter could be heard drifting in from the garden as he played some game with the neighbor's small dog. "What do you suggest, then?" "I will arrange for you and Oliver to stay somewhere safer, somewhere Reginald's man will not think to look, at least until I understand the full extent of what we are dealing with," Edmund said. "I have a property, a smaller estate several hours from here, left to me by my mother's side of the family. Reginald has no knowledge of it, as it was never part of the main inheritance. You would be safe there while I return to Ashcombe and uncover the truth of what Reginald knows and what he intends." Clara studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer, weighing, Edmund suspected, whether she could truly trust him after so many years of believing herself and her son abandoned. "And what happens after, Edmund?" she asked quietly. "After you have dealt with your cousin, after whatever danger this man Weston represents has passed, what becomes of Oliver then? What becomes of us?" It was the question Edmund had been avoiding since the moment he read Clara's letter, the question that reached far beyond the immediate danger and into the very shape of his future. "I do not yet know all the answers," he admitted, "but I know this much. Oliver is my son, and I do not intend to hide that truth or deny him his rightful place, whatever the cost to my own position. I have spent too many years living according to my father's wishes rather than my own conscience. I will not make that mistake again." Clara's eyes searched his face for a long moment, and whatever she found there seemed to ease some of the tension in her shoulders. "Very well," she said finally. "We will go to this property of yours. But Edmund, I must ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Ask it," Edmund said. "Are you doing this because you truly wish to know your son?" Clara asked. "Or because you fear what will happen to your title if Reginald acts against Oliver first?" The question struck Edmund harder than he expected, and he took a moment before answering, wanting to be certain his response reflected the truth rather than simply the easiest thing to say. "I will not pretend the matter of the title carries no weight in my thinking," he said slowly. "It would be dishonest to claim otherwise. But Clara, when I sat across from that boy this morning and watched him talk about fishing and horses and counting the rooms in a house he has never seen, I felt something I have not felt in years. Perhaps not since the last time I saw you, all those years ago. I want to know my son because he is remarkable, and because he is mine, and because 9 years is already too long to have missed. The matter of Reginald and the title is a danger we must address, yes, but it is not the reason I wish to stay in Oliver's life. I hope, in time, I can prove that to you through my actions rather than simply my words." Clara held his gaze for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, though the wariness never fully disappeared. "Then let us begin," she said, "before this man Weston or your cousin decides to act before we are ready for them." They spent the remainder of the morning making careful arrangements, Edmund sending word by a trusted messenger to have the smaller estate prepared for Clara and Oliver's arrival, while Clara began quietly packing what few belongings they would need for the journey. Oliver, unaware of the danger that had prompted this sudden change, seemed delighted by the prospect of an adventure, peppering both adults with questions about the new house and whether it, too, had a river nearby for fishing. By early afternoon, a modest carriage had been arranged, and Edmund stood in the small garden behind Clara's house, watching as Oliver ran back and forth chasing the neighbor's dog one final time before their departure. "You will send word once you have settled?" Edmund asked Clara. "I will," she said. "And you, Edmund, what will you do once you return to Ashcombe?" "I intend to speak with Reginald directly," Edmund said, his jaw setting with a determination that surprised even himself. "I will not allow him to threaten what remains of my family without answering for it first, and I intend to speak with my late father's former solicitor as well. If there are records of what truly happened 9 years ago, I mean to find them, whatever it takes." Clara nodded slowly, then hesitated, as though there was something more she wished to say but could not quite find the words for. "Edmund," she said finally, "whatever happens with your cousin, whatever the courts or society eventually decide about Oliver's place in your family, I want you to know that I am glad you came. I spent so many years believing you had chosen to walk away from us. It means more than I can say to learn that was never true." Edmund felt something tighten in his throat, an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel fully in longer than he could remember. "I only wish I had known sooner," he said quietly. "I have 9 years to make up for, Clara, and I intend to spend the rest of my life doing exactly that for both of you if you will allow it." As the carriage carrying Clara and Oliver disappeared down the narrow road leading away from the small town, Edmund stood alone for a long moment, watching until it vanished from sight entirely. Then he turned toward his own waiting carriage, his expression hardening into something colder and more determined than anything he had shown since the previous morning. Whatever Reginald intended, whatever secrets his father had buried 9 years ago, Edmund was finished allowing others to determine the course of his life and the lives of those he loved. He climbed into the carriage and gave the order to return to Ashcombe, his mind already turning toward the confrontation that now felt entirely unavoidable. The road ahead was long, but for the first time since signing away his marriage the previous morning, Edmund found that he knew, with absolute clarity, exactly what he intended to fight for. Ashcombe felt different when Edmund returned to it, though nothing about the estate itself had changed. The same tall gates, the same wide gravel drive, the same rows of ancient oak trees lining the approach to the great house. What had changed was Edmund himself, and the way he now viewed every stone and every servant and every carefully maintained tradition of the place he had spent his entire life calling home. He wasted no time once he arrived. After a brief rest and a change of clothes, he summoned Charles Bennet to the study and asked him to locate any records that might exist regarding his father's business dealings from 9 years earlier, particularly any payments made to persons outside the estate's usual circle of tradesmen and tenants. Charles returned within the hour, his expression carefully composed, though Edmund could see the concern flickering behind his eyes. "I have found something, Your Grace," Charles said, placing a thin ledger on the desk. "A payment recorded 9 years ago, listed simply as a settlement of personal matters. The amount was substantial, and it was authorized directly by your father, without the usual documentation that accompanies estate expenditures." Edmund examined the ledger carefully, his jaw tightening as he studied the entry. There was no name attached to the payment, no explanation beyond the vague phrase Charles had mentioned, but the date aligned precisely with the period when Clara had been forced to leave the area. "There is something else, Your Grace," Charles said carefully. "I made some additional inquiries, given the nature of your request. It appears your cousin, Mr. Reginald Whitmore, visited the estate archives only a month ago, while you were away attending to matters in the northern counties. He requested access to certain family records, citing an interest in family history for a personal project." Edmund's eyes snapped up. "What records did he request?" "Records pertaining to your father's private dealings during the years before your marriage to the Duchess," Charles said. "I did not think much of it at the time, Your Grace. Mr. Whitmore has always taken an interest in family history, but given what you have just asked me to investigate, I confess the timing now strikes me as significant." Edmund sat back in his chair, his mind working through the implications with cold, careful precision. If Reginald had gone searching through the archives and found some trace of the settlement made to Clara, or worse, if he had found some indication that a child existed who might one day challenge his position as heir, it would explain everything. It would explain Weston's presence in Clara's town, his careful questions about legitimacy and parentage, the entire quiet campaign of investigation that had been unfolding without Edmund's knowledge. "Send word to Reginald," Edmund said. "Tell him I wish to see him this evening at his convenience, but that the matter is urgent and cannot wait." Charles nodded and left to carry out the instruction, and Edmund spent the remaining hours of the afternoon reviewing every record he could find related to his father's dealings during that fateful year, piecing together a picture that grew more troubling with each document he uncovered. There were payments to a man who had apparently visited Clara's family home, payments to servants who had been instructed to turn her away from the estate gates, and finally, buried near the back of an old ledger, a brief note in his father's own hand, referring to the matter as handled and closed, with instructions that it never be mentioned again. Edmund read that final note 3 times, feeling something cold and heavy settle in his chest. His father had known. Whether he had known specifically about Oliver's existence or simply suspected the possibility, he had acted decisively to sever any connection between Edmund and Clara, and he had done so without a single thought for the consequences to either of them, or to the child who would grow up without knowing his own father. Reginald arrived at Ashcombe just as the sun was beginning to set, dressed in his usual fine clothing, his expression carrying the same faint air of superiority Edmund remembered from their childhood, when Reginald had always seemed to resent the fact that Edmund, not he, would one day inherit the title and everything attached to it. "Edmund," Reginald said as he entered the study, offering a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "I understand you wish to see me on a matter of some urgency. I confess I am curious what could possibly require such haste." "Sit down, Reginald," Edmund said, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I think you already know why I have called you here." Reginald's smile faltered only slightly as he lowered himself into the chair across from the desk. "I am afraid I do not understand your meaning." "Do you not?" Edmund said. "Then perhaps you can explain why you visited the family archives a month ago, requesting records from 9 years past. Or perhaps you can explain why a man named Weston has spent the last several weeks in a small town several hours from here, asking questions about a woman and her young son." The color drained slightly from Reginald's face, though he recovered quickly, his expression settling back into careful neutrality. "I am not certain what you are suggesting, Edmund." "I am suggesting," Edmund said, leaning forward across the desk, "that you learned of my son's existence and sent a man to investigate, with the intention of using that knowledge against me, against him, or against both of us, in whatever manner best protected your own claim to this title." For a long moment, Reginald said nothing, and the silence between them stretched thin and dangerous. Then slowly, his careful composure began to crack, revealing something harder and more calculating beneath. "And if I did," Reginald said finally, his voice losing its earlier pretense of confusion, "what precisely do you intend to do about it, Edmund? You cannot deny that a child born outside of marriage, to a woman of no particular standing, presents a considerable complication for a family such as ours. Society does not look kindly upon such matters, whatever your personal feelings toward the boy may be." "He is my son," Edmund said, his voice hard as stone. "Whatever society thinks of the circumstances of his birth, I intend to acknowledge him, and I intend to see that he is provided for, regardless of what that means for your own expectations." Reginald's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Edmund saw something genuinely unsettling flicker behind his cousin's carefully maintained composure. "You would risk everything," Reginald said slowly. "The family name, the estate's reputation, your own standing among our peers, all for a boy born to a woman your own father saw fit to send away. Have you considered, Edmund, what such a public acknowledgement would truly cost you?" "I have considered it a great deal," Edmund said. "And I have decided that whatever it costs me, it is a smaller price than the one already paid by a child who grew up without a father because my own father believed reputation mattered more than truth. I will not make his mistake." Reginald rose from his chair slowly, straightening his jacket with careful, deliberate movements that did nothing to hide the anger now clearly visible in his expression. "You understand," he said quietly, "that I will not simply stand aside and allow my own position to be threatened without response. If you intend to acknowledge this boy, Edmund, you should know that I intend to contest any claim he might have to this family's name and holdings with every resource available to me. I have already begun making certain arrangements, certain inquiries into the legitimacy of any such claim, and I do not intend to abandon them simply because you have decided to grow a conscience 9 years too late." "Then we understand each other," Edmund said, rising from his own chair to meet his cousin's gaze directly. But heed this warning, Reginald. If any harm comes to Clara or to Oliver, if your man Weston or anyone acting on your behalf takes any action against them, I will ensure that every resource of this family, every connection I possess, is turned toward exposing exactly what you have done and exactly why you have done it. I do not believe you wish for that particular truth to become public knowledge." Reginald's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, simply turning and walking toward the door with the same careful, controlled dignity he had entered with, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. "This is not finished, Edmund," he said finally, pausing at the threshold. "Whatever you believe you owe this boy, I intend to protect what is rightfully mine, by whatever means prove necessary." The door closed behind him with a soft, final click, and Edmund stood alone in his study once more, the weight of his cousin's threat settling heavily over him. He thought of Clara and Oliver, safely tucked away at his mother's old estate, and felt a fresh wave of urgency move through him. Whatever Reginald intended, whatever lengths he was prepared to go to in order to protect his claim, Edmund knew he could not afford to wait and see what form that threat might eventually take. He summoned Charles once more, this time with a different set of instructions. "I need everything you can find on the legal process for acknowledging a child born outside of marriage," Edmund said. "I need to understand exactly what steps must be taken to secure Oliver's position, and I need to understand them quickly, before my cousin has the opportunity to interfere with the process." Charles nodded, though his expression carried a note of caution Edmund had rarely seen from the normally composed solicitor. "Your Grace, I must caution you that such a process, however swiftly conducted, will not remain private for long. Word of this nature travels quickly among families of standing, and once it becomes known, there will be no controlling how society chooses to receive it." "I am aware of that," Edmund said, "but I would rather face whatever judgment society chooses to pass than continue living as though the truth does not exist. Begin the necessary preparations, Charles. I intend to move forward with this, regardless of the consequences." As Charles departed to begin the work, Edmund found himself standing once more at the study window, looking out over the grounds of the estate that had been his entire life, the grounds that had shaped him into a man who had once believed duty mattered more than truth, more than love, more than the simple, undeniable fact of his own son's existence. He thought of his father, and for the first time since learning the truth, he felt something shift within him, a final release of the old obligation to please a man who had valued reputation above every other consideration. Whatever came next, whatever battles lay ahead with Reginald or with society at large, Edmund knew he would not turn back from the path he had chosen. But even as he stood there, resolve hardening within him, a small, persistent worry continued to gnaw at the edges of his thoughts. Reginald's parting words had carried a weight of genuine threat, not merely the empty posturing of wounded pride. Whatever his cousin intended, Edmund suspected it would not wait long to reveal itself, and he found himself hoping with an intensity that surprised him, that Clara and Oliver remained exactly as safe as he had promised they would be. The message arrived at Ashcombe just before dawn, carried by a breathless rider who had changed horses twice to make the journey in record time. Edmund tore open the letter before the rider had even finished dismounting, his heart pounding with a dread he could not quite name. The letter was from Clara, and though her handwriting remained steady, the words themselves carried an unmistakable urgency. "A man came to the estate yesterday evening, claiming to represent legal interests connected to your family," she had written. "He asked to speak with Oliver directly, insisting he needed to verify certain details for a legal proceeding. I refused to allow it and sent him away, but Edmund, I do not believe this is the last we will see of him. I fear your cousin intends to act more directly than either of us anticipated." Edmund's hands tightened around the letter, anger and fear moving through him in equal measure. He called for Charles immediately, and within the hour, a carriage stood ready in the courtyard, prepared to carry him the several hours' journey to his mother's estate where Clara and Oliver remained. "Your Grace," Charles said as Edmund prepared to depart, "I have completed my review of the legal matters we discussed. I believe I have also found something that may prove significant to your cousin's claims against Oliver's legitimacy." Edmund paused at the carriage door. "Tell me." "Among your father's papers," Charles said, producing a small bundle of documents, "I discovered correspondence between your father and the man he employed to handle the matter of Clara's departure 9 years ago. In this correspondence, your father explicitly acknowledges the existence of a child and instructs the man to ensure that Clara received sufficient funds to provide for, in your father's own words, his grandson." Edmund stared at the papers Charles held out to him, his breath catching in his throat. "My father knew," he said quietly. "He knew about Oliver from the very beginning." "It would appear so, Your Grace," Charles said. "And more importantly, this correspondence in your father's own hand, acknowledging the child as his grandson, provides significant support for any claim you wish to make regarding Oliver's legitimate connection to this family. Your cousin will find it considerably more difficult to argue against a child your own father recognized, however privately, as his direct descendant." Edmund took the documents carefully, tucking them into his coat alongside the letter that had started this entire journey only days earlier. "Charles, I need you to prepare these documents for immediate legal use. Send word ahead to the courts that I intend to formally acknowledge my son, and that I have documentation supporting his claim as my rightful heir." "It shall be done, Your Grace," Charles said, "though I suspect, given what you have described of your cousin's recent actions, that speed may prove more important than usual in this particular matter." Edmund nodded grimly and climbed into the waiting carriage, calling for the driver to make all possible haste toward his mother's estate. The journey passed in a blur of anxious thought, Edmund's mind cycling endlessly through worst possibilities, each more troubling than the last. He thought of Reginald's parting threat, of the stranger who had appeared at Clara's door asking to speak with Oliver directly, and he found himself gripping the edge of his seat with white-knuckled tension as the carriage raced through the countryside. When the carriage finally rolled up the long drive toward the smaller estate, Edmund felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly took his breath away at the sight of Clara standing on the front steps, Oliver beside her, both of them clearly safe and unharmed. "Edmund," Clara said as he climbed down from the carriage, hurrying toward him, "thank goodness you have come. The man returned again this morning, more insistent than before. I sent him away once more, but Edmund, he made mention of legal papers, of a hearing that has apparently already been scheduled." "A hearing?" Edmund felt a fresh surge of alarm. "What hearing?" "He would not say precisely," Clara said, "only that matters concerning Oliver's parentage would soon be decided by the courts, whether we wish to participate or not." Edmund's jaw tightened with cold fury. Reginald had moved faster than he anticipated, clearly attempting to establish some manner of legal precedent before Edmund could formally acknowledge Oliver himself, perhaps hoping to have the boy declared illegitimate through some manipulated proceeding before Edmund had the opportunity to present his own case. "We must return to Ashcombe immediately," Edmund said. "I have documents, Clara, proof that my father knew of Oliver's existence and acknowledged him privately as his own grandson. If Reginald intends to force this matter before the courts, then we shall meet him there, prepared with truth on our side rather than allowing him to control the narrative alone." Within the hour, they were traveling back toward Ashcombe together, Oliver seated between them in the carriage, sensing enough of the adult's tension to remain unusually quiet, though his eyes darted curiously between Edmund and his mother, as though trying to understand the nature of the danger neither of them wished to name directly in his presence. They arrived at Ashcombe as evening fell, and Charles met them at the entrance with news that confirmed Edmund's worst suspicions. Reginald had indeed petitioned the local courts, requesting an urgent hearing regarding the legitimacy of any claim connected to Edmund's title, citing concerns about fraudulent attempts to introduce an illegitimate heir into the family line. The hearing had been scheduled for the following morning, clearly timed to catch Edmund unprepared. "He moves quickly," Edmund said grimly, "but not quickly enough. Charles, prepare everything we have. The correspondence from my father, Clara's testimony, any records that support the truth of what happened 9 years ago. I intend to be more prepared for this hearing than my cousin could possibly anticipate." That night, Edmund, Charles, and Clara worked late into the evening, organizing every piece of evidence they could assemble, while Oliver slept upstairs, blissfully unaware of the battle being fought on his behalf. Edmund found himself grateful, in a strange way, for Reginald's haste. Had his cousin waited longer, taken more time to build a stronger case, the outcome might have proven far less certain. But in his rush to act before Edmund could formally acknowledge Oliver, Reginald had left himself vulnerable to exactly the kind of documented truth Edmund now possessed. The following morning, the small courtroom in the nearby town filled with an unusual number of observers, word having spread quickly through the local gentry that a matter of significant scandal involving the Duke of Ashcombe was to be heard. Edmund entered with Clara and Charles beside him, his expression carefully composed despite the whispers that followed his entrance, while Reginald sat across the room with an expression of confident satisfaction that Edmund suspected would not survive the morning's proceedings. The magistrate presiding over the hearing was an older man named Judge Harlan, known throughout the county for his careful, methodical approach to matters of family law, and he wasted little time in calling the proceedings to order. Reginald's solicitor spoke first, presenting the argument that Oliver, being born to a woman with no legal marriage to Edmund, held no legitimate claim to the Whitmore family name or title, and that any attempt to formally acknowledge the boy represented a fraudulent effort to disrupt the established line of inheritance, an effort Reginald's solicitor characterized as motivated purely by Edmund's recent and highly public divorce. When it came time for Edmund's response, Charles rose and presented the correspondence discovered among the late Duke's private papers, reading aloud the section in which Edmund's father explicitly acknowledged Oliver's existence and referred to him directly as his own grandson. A murmur moved through the observers gathered in the courtroom, and Edmund watched with grim satisfaction as Reginald's confident expression began to falter. Clara then took her turn to speak, describing with quiet dignity the circumstances of her departure from the area 9 years earlier, the payments made by the late Duke's representative, and the letter falsely attributed to her own hand that had convinced Edmund she had abandoned him willingly. Judge Harlan listened carefully, occasionally asking pointed questions that Clara answered with the same steady honesty she had shown Edmund from the very first moment of his return into her life. Finally, Edmund himself rose to speak, and for the first time since the proceedings began, he felt the full weight of everything that had led him to this moment, the divorce he had signed without a second thought, the letter that had changed the entire course of his life, the son he had only just begun to know but already loved with a fierceness that surprised him. "I do not deny the circumstances of my son's birth," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I do not deny that society may judge those circumstances harshly, and I understand the scandal this acknowledgement will bring upon my family's name. But I will not allow fear of judgment to keep me from claiming my own son, a boy who has spent 9 years without a father through no fault of his own, kept from me by a deception I only recently discovered. My father may have believed reputation mattered more than truth, but I have learned at great cost that such thinking serves no one, least of all the innocent child caught in its wake. Oliver is my son. I acknowledge him fully before this court and before anyone who wishes to challenge that truth, and I will provide for him and protect him for the remainder of my life." The courtroom remained silent for a long moment after Edmund finished speaking, and even Reginald seemed to have lost some of his earlier confidence. his eyes darting nervously toward his solicitor as though seeking some path forward that no longer seemed to exist. Judge Harlan reviewed the evidence presented for a considerable time before finally delivering his ruling, his voice carrying the measured authority of a man who had presided over countless family disputes throughout his long career. Given the documented acknowledgement made by the late Duke of Ashcombe, Judge Harlan said, and given the testimony provided regarding the circumstances of the child's birth and subsequent separation from his father, this court finds sufficient grounds to recognize Oliver as the legitimate son and rightful heir of Edmund Whitmore, Duke of Ashcombe. Any challenge to this recognition, Mr. Whitmore, he added, turning his attention pointedly toward Reginald, would require considerably stronger evidence than what has been presented here today. Reginald's face went pale, and he rose stiffly from his seat, offering no further argument as the courtroom began to empty, the assembled observers already murmuring amongst themselves about the scandal and its surprising resolution. Edmund watched his cousin leave without a word, and felt, rather than triumph, a strange and quiet relief that the matter had finally reached its conclusion. Outside the courthouse, Clara stood waiting with Oliver, who had remained with the elderly neighbor woman during the proceedings and had since been brought to hear the outcome. "It is done," Edmund said, kneeling down to meet Oliver's curious gaze directly. "You are recognized now, Oliver, as my son, before the law and before anyone who might wish to say otherwise." Oliver considered this information with the same careful seriousness he brought to most matters, then looked up at Edmund with a small, uncertain smile. "Does that mean I get to live in the house with all the rooms?" Despite everything, Edmund found himself laughing, a genuine, unguarded laugh that felt unfamiliar after so many years of careful restraint. "Yes, Oliver. If your mother agrees, I would very much like for both of you to live there with me." Clara's eyes met his over Oliver's head, and in them, Edmund saw not the wariness of their first reunion, but something warmer, something that suggested the possibility of a future neither of them had dared to imagine only days earlier. "We would need to discuss the particulars," Clara said, though there was a softness in her voice that had not been there before. "But I believe, Edmund, that we might finally be ready to build the life that was taken from us 9 years ago." In the months that followed, Ashcombe slowly transformed from the cold, quiet estate it had been under Edmund's failed marriage into something warmer and more alive than it had been in years. Oliver's laughter echoed through hallways that had once known only silence, and Clara, though never formally married to Edmund in those early months, took her place at his side with a quiet grace that won over even the most skeptical members of the local gentry, who found it difficult to maintain their disapproval in the face of Oliver's obvious happiness and Edmund's evident devotion to his son. Reginald withdrew from public society for a time, his reputation somewhat diminished by the failed legal challenge, though Edmund, in a gesture that surprised even himself, chose not to pursue any further consequence against his cousin, believing that the truth finally brought into the light was punishment enough for a scheme built entirely on deception. Edmund often thought, in the quiet evenings that followed, of that single moment when he had signed the divorce papers without a second glance, believing he understood exactly what his life had become. He had been wrong, he realized, in more ways than he could have imagined that day. The divorce had not been the ending he believed it to be. It had been, in truth, only the beginning of a far more important story, one written not in the cold language of legal documents, but in the small, precious moments of a father finally learning to know his son, and in the quiet, hopeful possibility of a love that had never truly disappeared, only waited patiently for the truth to finally set it free.